For this first video on Iron Bottom Sound shipwrecks, we have one of the less famous examples. Other ships overshadowed her in the battles off of Guadalcanal. Other wrecks got more interest, like Hiei and Kirishima. Her name is by no means the first to come to mind, either. Even so, USS Astoria is one of the more unique shipwrecks out there, mostly because of her bow and where it managed to land. I can't think of another case quite like it off the top of my head. Before we get to that, however, a brief summary of her sinking. As a New Orleans-class heavy cruiser, Astoria was a powerful ship, armed with 9 8-inch guns and capable of just under 33 knots. Unfortunately, that didn't really apply on a nighttime ambush. The Battle of Savo Island, on the night of August 8, 1942, was a confused mess. The Japanese ambushed and utterly ravaged an Allied cruiser force. Astoria, alongside 2 of her sisters, was sent to the bottom. Unlike her sister ships, however, Astoria remained afloat into the daylight hours of August 9th. The ship was battered by everything from 8-inch to 5-inch shells. These had, among other things, knocked out her number 1 turret and set a massive fire in her floatplane hangar. Nonetheless, in spite of this severe and extensive damage, Astoria remained stubbornly afloat. In fact, by 7 a.m. on August 9th, a tow line was rigged up by USS Hopkins to get the cruiser to shallow water. While Hopkins was called away for other duty a couple hours later, a point had been made. The Navy considered Astoria a ship they could save. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be. In spite of help from other destroyers, the fires below deck on Astoria were raging out of control. No amount of pumping from either the cruiser or her escorts was enough. Explosions below deck were audible topside. Astoria, already listing to port, began to tilt over even more. By noon, the list was so severe that the remaining crew had to abandon ship. Astoria rolled over onto her port side and sank by her stern. 219 of her crew were killed or missing in action. As for her wreck, it would have to wait a bit to be discovered. Her sister, USS Quincy, was discovered by Robert Ballard in 1992. Astoria, meanwhile, was only located in 2015 on one of the earlier expeditions by Paul Allen's team. So early, in fact, that this predates the Petrel expeditions. That vessel was only acquired in 2016. So, when you see MY Octopus on the following pictures, that's referencing Allen's yacht, the Octopus. In any case, this expedition located several wrecks, Astoria among them. The wreck was located at a depth of 860 meters, or 2,820 feet. Not the deepest wreck out there by any means, but deep enough to keep her safe from salvage. When you look at that wreck, the first thing you'll probably notice, looking at the sonar here, is the broken bow. This is not inherently surprising. American cruisers had a disturbing tendency to lose their bows in the Pacific War. For example, Astoria's sister Quincy lost her own bow. What makes Astoria interesting is where her bow landed. Some viewers will note a rather large piece of steel sticking up on the ship towards the stern. That is, in fact, the cruiser's bow. It detached as she sank, and by some twist of fate, managed to land back on top of the ship. I'm not going to say this is unique, but it's certainly unusual. That said, let's move on from the sonar, as there is little else to make note of here, other than the twisted ruin that remains of Astoria's superstructure. And for those curious, side-scan sonar does cast a shadow effect. It's just very distinctive on Astoria. Moving on, however, most of the pictures of the wreck are going to be of the weaponry. I'm making note of that in advance because I know some viewers aren't terribly interested in the guns. Nonetheless, I'll start with those. First, we have the infamous Chicago piano. More accurately, the quad 1.1-inch cannon mount. This was the standard American anti-aircraft gun at the start of the war. It was not particularly popular and was replaced by 20mm cannon and 40mm Bofors wherever possible. As Astoria sank in 1942, however, she still had these weapons. This particular mount is, broadly speaking, intact. All of the barrels are in place, with relatively minimal corrosion. The mount itself is also mostly there, just completely covered in marine growth. The same goes for the gun tub around it, a side effect of the relatively shallow depth on this wreck. Arguably more interesting than the mount in this case is the deck. In spite of the fires and time underwater, the teak decking is still clearly visible. It's actually some of the better looking decking I've seen on a shipwreck, with a lack of silt and identifiable planks. With that mount covered, however, let's look at one of the replacements for the Chicago piano. Here you can see two 20mm cannon pointing directly up, and covered completely in marine growth. With the general damage to the bow area, this is likely a gun platform on the stern section of the ship, probably the aft superstructure. Rusting is far more apparent in this area. With the classic rough texture you expect of corrosion damage. In spite of that, the overall condition is still pretty good. Nothing has collapsed completely, and the general shape of the ship remains recognizable. It does look like a shell hit in this area from the damage to the superstructure. The 20mm guns, on the other hand, aren't pointing up because of battle damage, or because they were watching for air attack. On basically any American shipwreck you look at, if it has 20mm cannon, they'll be pointing skyward. That's because water pressure, as the ship sank, pushed them to that angle, and they've remained that way ever since. There might also be some damage to the elevation mechanism as well. Although it isn't a universal thing, because you'll sometimes see cannon that aren't elevated, such as this one here, pointing over the ship's hulk. This cannon still has some of its gun shield, as well as the handles at the rear. It is also completely covered in rusticles. The more interesting thing here, of course, is what the gun is pointing at. Resting across from its gun tub, and hanging over what appears to be a gun turret, is Astoria's anchor chain. This is wrapped over most of the ship, as we'll see here and there, still attached to the bow, as it fell back aboard the hull. As there's little else to see here but twisted metal, I'll move to the 5-inch guns now. The first one seen here is a bit more clean looking than most. There's sea life taking root on it, to be fair, but neither the gun or mount are covered in mud. It allows for picking out details that you might miss on other wrecks. The railing where the gun crew stood, for example, is still there, and a gun sight is still fitted as well. The gun tub may be a little worse for wear, but the gun is in excellent condition considering. As for the other 5-inch gun photographed here, well, it's a bit rougher. Most of the mount is gone, either from battle damage or the passage of time. Basically all that's left is the gun barrel, the breech, and some railing. If the last one was one of the better looking 5-inch guns I've seen, well, this is one of the worst. It does have the benefit of some equipment visible in the background, but the darkness makes it difficult to make out what any of it is. I would guess a ready ammunition locker, but I can't be sure. With that covered, let's move to the big guns. There are only 2 pictures of these, one of the bow turrets and one of the stern turret. When Astoria's number 1 gun turret was hit and knocked out, it was pointing astern and to port. That's visible on the damage plate as seen here. And on the wreck today, you can still see that. The lower turret is pointing out in the darkness. Unfortunately, because of that darkness, you can't make out much more detail. None of these shell holes are visible from this angle, and while the barrels look decent enough, that's hard to be sure. The same goes for the turret itself. On the other hand, at least you can see the turret. The number 2 turret is out of frame, with only encrusted barrels poking out. These are all fixed in place, and with no apparent damage, other than from rust. Even then, the paint still seems to be visible, where the barrels aren't completely coated in sea life. All of that aside, the only other things of note are the anchor chain and the superstructure. You can make out some of the latter beneath the barrels of the number 2 turret. The anchor chain, meanwhile, is stretched over turret 1 and wrapped around the barrels of turret 2 before stretching off into the darkness. That same chain is visible in this next picture of the overturned bow, including the mounting point of the aforementioned chain. This is one of several images of the bow, and all of them are very strange. You don't normally see a bow upside down on the wooden deck of its ship. The next 2 images are also of the bow, but marginally less strange. Still inverted, but you can't really see the rest of Astoria's hull. Just the broken bow and an anchor that remains in place. While the anchor is dirty, it doesn't show any apparent damage. A closer look shows more of the rust, but the writing on the anchor is still visible as well. It's certainly not as pretty as the equivalent anchor on USS Indianapolis. However, you can still make out US Navy pretty clearly, and 1929, although a bit less clearly. Any more than that is difficult to read. However, I know what people really want to see. That's the thumbnail and the most distinctive picture on the wreck. Astoria's bow resting against the back of her number 3 turret. The shape of the bow is still clearly recognizable as it pushes up against the siding hood of the turret. That hood is open, giving a view inside. And right in front of it, you have the anchor chain once again. This time wrapped around the turret before leaving the frame on either end. As for the anchors, you can see the one from earlier at the top of the image. Barely. With that said, however, we've reached the end of the video. There are only 2 pictures left, both of which don't have much to see. First, an image of a shell impact. Where this is on the ship, I'm not sure. It is, after all, just one of many similar impacts. That just leaves one more to round it off. This picture of Astoria's extreme stern. Much like a similar picture of USS Juno, this is yellowed with age. Yet the name is still clear. Astoria. With another shell impact or corrosion damage beneath the letter S. A reminder that nearly every part of this ship suffered some form of damage. And yet, she still very nearly survived. There's something to be said for that, I think. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.